Okay, Alex Todaro's work combines food systems thinking, behavioral psychology, performance, and design to create experiences that model group dynamics and social systems. He has worked with NASA, Spotify, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and GE. These are very abbreviated, we apologize. Abraham Burickson is the co-founder of Odyssey Works, a collaborative of artists creating performances for small, intimately known audiences. His work has been profiled on NPR's Studio 360, in the New York Times, Newsweek, and Fast Company. Please warmly welcome Alex and Abe.
So this is mostly Alex's lecture, but I'm just going to sort of pop in a little bit. And I wanted to introduce and maybe contextualize a little bit of what Alex does. And by way of introduction to his work, I'd like to say that, first of all, I love design. I think you love design. I love how it's practiced now. I love that designers, humans around the world, are continually scanning the graphics, the architecture, the built world in front of them and looking for ways that they can make it better, that they could see where things are failing, that they can make things more efficient or more affordable or even more beautiful. I love that. But I think that there is a fundamental flaw. And this is the flaw of the editor or of the problem solver. It's the problem of the narrow focus that is brought by specialization. Because when the design approaches of the industry are focused on making that door close a little more quietly, or making that smartwatch a little bit more enticing to use, or making that wayfinding system just a little bit clearer, we don't get a chance to look at the big picture into which those things fit. The house and why the house is more of a home, or the airport that wayfinding system directs us through, and how people are moving through society with that airport as a hub. This means not only are we doomed to incrementalization, but that we find ourselves unable to approach the ethical questions in design that seem to be getting more and more important every day. Alex's work offers an approach to design that contains learnings not just from design thinking, but from slow design and other slow movements. His approach offers a way to look not only at the big picture, but to see our own roles in that picture and to ask the hard questions that might allow for larger systems to be understood and for the people inside those systems to understand their roles and for those systems to then be altered. And when we look at those bigger systems and when we look at things from that zoomed out point of view, we can ask the ethical questions that involve not just improvements, but system functionings, and not just system functionings that we understand from a distance as designers, but how we ourselves are involved in them. Because when we look this way, we see how humans and designers themselves can be understood by the practice of design. So here's Alex. He's going to do all that.
Thank you. Design. Okay. How's everybody doing? I hear you guys have been working hard on your alter egos. Yeah? Okay. You just finished. I'm Alex Todaro. I originally come from Colorado and have most recently been living in New York, although over the past 7 months I've been pretty nomadic, traveling around Europe. I worked on a biodynamic farm in Italy and it was pretty life-changing. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of MICA, and I first just want to thank Ellen and JCP and Jason, as well as all of you, for having me here. And I want to thank Abe Burickson, who's a dear friend and colleague of mine, and getting to do this with him has been super exciting to me too. Cool. So a little bit of background about me. So I've had many faces as a designer, and so I started out my trajectory, I went to undergrad in Columbia College, Chicago. I was doing a lot of gig posters and printmaking and sort of branding for small kind of events and studios out there. And this is super fun. It was like the best way for a young graphic designer to cut his teeth. Posters are like big business cards that get thrown around the city, and I got to meet a lot of cool bands and go to a lot of shows. But at the end of that, I was sort of getting to this place where I wanted to start looking at design from more of a systemic point of view. How do I look at things beyond aesthetics and start getting to things that have a little bit more meaning behind them to me? So that had me land at the School of Visual Arts Interaction Design MFA in New York, where I spent 2 very illuminating and kind of grueling years in an interaction design program, right? So there we learned about prototyping, systems research, fabrication, and this project here are these kind of like trash critters that I made that teach children about recycling. So there's RFIDs and Arduinos and little kind of CNC pieces that when you put it in the wrong bin, it'll like growl at you, or if it's in the right bin, it'll be like, So that was fun. So after Interaction Design MFA, I somehow landed in the strange world of organizational consulting or organizational design. And for the past 3 years, I was running a company called Median with my former partner Athena Diakonis. This is our Christmas card that we sent last year to clients. But so organizational design is all about using design practices to help organizations build companies with purpose and missions. And from that strong purpose and mission, you basically understand what are the values and how do we build operations, management structures, processes, all from those values. So it's taking kind of a traditional way of thinking, a traditional system of top-down management consulting, and say, how do we create more sort of emergent and personal sort of mechanisms and processes within companies. So this has been really inspiring to the way that I approach design, and is a very different than gig posters, but the sort of thing that has been a through line for me in all of my design practice is this question, a deep, deep curiosity in thinking about how people make meaning in their lives, and then from that meaning that they make, how they are making decisions after it. And so now I call myself an experienced designer, but I think, sort of looking at this, there's always been an element of experience in the work that I do and considering this side of it. So today, we will be talking about experience design as transformation. And so a couple goals that I have, there's a lot of meaning behind experience design, and it sort of lives in a lot of places. So my first hope is just making sure that you guys have a little bit of an understanding of what this is. I'm going to show you some examples of how experience design is being practiced. And then my biggest hope is that this inspires your curiosity to think about ways that you can apply some of these sort of approaches in your practices. And we can make this a conversation. I mean, I've prepared remarks, obviously, but if you have a question, right, or you want to comment on something, feel free to, right? This can be a discussion, and there's a lot of thoughts that I've thrown into this, so if something's unclear, just stop me, we can talk through it. So I want to start at the beginning. What is an experience? So we're experiencing things all the time, right? We can have a meal, or a conversation with friends, or riding on the subway, and not to mention the sort of sensory experience that is always happening at every moment of every day. So I actually just want us to close our eyes right now, everyone. Take us a deep breath, and just notice, what is your body actually experiencing right now? Some sounds, maybe some smells, hopefully good ones. Okay, you can open your eyes. Right, so at any given point, there's lots of things that are sort of happening around us that we are experiencing. But what really is this? So think about when you're telling your friends or sort of family about an experience that you just recently had, what are some of the components of it, right? Usually you're thinking about a remarkable experience, a highs and lows, something really awesome happened today, or like something really crappy happened today. Or things about illumination, right? That are kind of noteworthy or unique. I learned something, or like, oh my God, this guy showed up with the American flag in his back, like riding through campus doing this thing, right? So experiences have, there's a certain quality and component to it where you're excited. It's sort of alarming us and different to what we're experiencing day to day. So it can illuminate, or if we're even lucky, sometimes be transformative. And I want to call out this distinction here. So on one side, there's sort of these experiences of value, these things that are noteworthy and unique, and then there's all the other stuff that can be sort of background sensory experiences where we sit down and watch TV. And I'll be referring to kind of this space, the experience of value, for the rest of this talk as sort of the true experience, right? This is true experience. So why is this? What is it about this true experience? So I want to look at just a quick study from MIT that was done with this researcher, Anne Grable, where they were studying the neurological activity of rats. So the experiment was they put a bunch of receptors in the rats' brains, plopped them into a maze. At the end of the maze, there was chocolate. They would flip the door open, and the rats had to kind of eventually find their way to the chocolate. And they repeated this experiment over and over again with the same rats. And so some really interesting results came out. When the rats were new to the maze, they opened the door and it started sort of sniffing at the walls and kind of slowly walking out, just trying to get used to the environment. It wasn't physically moving a lot, but its brain activity was off of the charts, right? As they continued this experiment and had the rat go through the maze more and more times and it developed these habits and routines, its brain activity decreased dramatically, right? It almost stopped. They called this chunking. And so chunking is basically this idea that we have these mental scripts that run when we've developed a routine or a habit around something. And humans have tons of these, right? It's a trick for conserving our mental energy, or just conserving general energy in our body, right? Imagine if we spent time and energy processing every single thing that came into our being, right? It'd be overwhelming. So, brushing our teeth, sitting in front of a computer, backing out of the driveway, these are scripts that we have. And in this moment, very little brain activity. We're just sort of running through it. Like, I don't know, have you ridden up an elevator and you're like, I have no idea what just happened, right? These things happen to us all the time. And so what I want to point out in this, right, as brain activity decreases as we have familiarity, right, this space is super exciting. A new experience equals more brain activity. When something shocks us or something ignites us that we're not familiar with, tons of brain activity. So I want to offer this definition of experience. A true experience happened we are consciously active and alert to the inputs of our environment, and then discovering and making new meaning as a result of that active engagement. So let's look at some things that are experience versus a non-experience. So going on a hike or an adventure versus taking a shower, non-experience. Going to a concert versus sitting on an empty subway. Live action role playing or LARPing compared to doing your laundry. You're going to learn that I'm a big fan of models over the next 3 days. So I wanted to show a model about this. So Dr. Robert Epstein has this model about the progression of experience that I think is pretty apt for this. There's 3 things. We observe inputs in our environment, what's happening in our environment. Then we're exposed to the pairing of important stimuli and unimportant stimuli. And then we are punished or rewarded for how we respond to that stimuli. So what this looks like, the model of experience. We have an input, something happens that we're exposed to. We have to make meaning from it, whether this is important or not. We're going to make a choice in an environment through an experience, and then the outcome of that, we either punish or reward. And so this is very important. We're going to refer back to this a lot in this talk and over the weekend. But what I really want to drive home is that in this making meaning period, there's a lot of really interesting correlations about the nature of what's an experience and not an experience. Here, okay. So in the experience, right, important stimuli is undecided. We're very present and open. We have no established routines. But in the non-experience, non-important stimuli is already decided. We know what we need to block out, right? So this becomes a really interesting distinction of just our mental state and what's happening with us. But these are not fixed. So imagine a non-experience, right? Imagine you're about to go take a shower and then you open the door of the curtain and all of a sudden hundreds of birds fly out of your shower. This would be shocking. This would be unique and noteworthy, and it would change the meaning that you have about taking a shower. So you might make a different choice, right? You might say, I'm never going to take a shower again, or you might approach the shower door with more caution the next time that you do this, right? So this is a feedback loop, and this is super exciting for designers. Feedback loops are very simple, but the opportunity here is quite profound, because in this loop is where people learn and grow. It's where we try something, and then we say, this is now important or not. And when we are learning and growing in a feedback loop, a lot of our values, our beliefs, our worldview happen in this space. And this is such a big, valuable part of experience, right? And Dr. Epstein, who proposed this model, says we become more effective in our lives if we change and grow in ways that are consistent with that experience. So going back to the original definition, right? New experiences help us to make new meaning because we're conscious and aware, but then that leads to our own personal growth. And I think that's really cool. So what is experience design, now that we understand what experience is? Based on that definition, the simplest thing of experience, and I just made this up, something created with a purpose, plan, or intention of facilitating the discovery of new meaning. It's pretty generic, it's pretty broad. And then we could argue that most design tries to do something in this camp, right? And experience design, I'll admit, is pretty new as we think about it as a practice, right? As we think about it as people who are self-identifying themselves as experience design and going out into the market to make work. There's still not a consensus on this definition, but we're going to dive into that today. So the first I want to look at is material in experience design. So all design disciplines generally have their own sets of materials, the things that they're working with and dealing with. So in graphic design, and these are rough, I know there's more to it, but just to throw it out, graphic design is color, form, composition, typography. Product design is object, material, and ergonomics, right? Experience design is looking at things like space and environment, it's looking at time, it's looking at sensory inputs, right? We talked about storytelling, and then most importantly, context and relationships. And I think that this is the biggest distinguishing quality of experience design as a practice versus the others. So basically, experience design is asking what is the meaning of things versus what is the function of things, right? We're looking at space in between and that creating meaning versus how does this hammer help me hammer a nail, or how does this dash button help me get Amazon orders more quickly, right? So as I see it, experience design is being practiced in generally these 5 spaces. So entertainment, instruction, promotion, hospitality, and services. And as much as it's being applied in a lot of these places is that we're hoping that the experience is just leading to joy or delight or to be frictionless, right? We want people to feel good. But that's kind of the only space that we get to, sort of this hospitable lens. And I think that there's a lot more there. So I want to focus on immersive experiences. And the reason I want to do this is just because so much of what's happening in the industry right now, and even there were sort of murmurs of Museum of Ice Cream right when we were walking in the room. This is kind of what a lot of people think experience design is, right? These are pop-up immersive marketing experiences. So for the sake of comparison and to kind of drill this back, I'm going to quickly walk us through 4 examples and we'll analyze that, okay? So the first is Meow Wolf. How many people have heard of Meow Wolf? Cool. It's pretty rad. Full disclosure, there's some friends of mine and I've done some small projects with Meow Wolf in the past. But it's an art collective in Santa Fe that converted an old bowling alley. It's 10,000 square feet of just interactive sort of experiential art space, right? So there's a Victorian house, and the story is that this Victorian house was built on a temporal void and that all these portals happened up around it. So participants walk through the space and you open up like a refrigerator or a washing machine, and you can dive down then into an enchanted forest or into a space station. So it's non-linear, it's very open, it's very sort of tactile. It's made by a bunch of local artists in the area. You have to contort your body to squeeze through different things. But the storytelling, it's not so consequential that there's a story part of it. You can just start to move through. Whisper Lodge. So how many people have heard of Whisper Lodge? Just a few. So Whisper Lodge is there's kind of this very intimate pop-up immersive experience that happened in New York. They've gone to LA and San Francisco as well now too, but it's 4 people for each show, and it's all about experiences around ASMR. So ASMR is audio sensory meridian response, which is a sort of thing that your body can, it's like tingling sensations in your body when you hear like whispers or like tapping sounds, right? So there's a whole kind of online presence around it. But Whisper Lodge is really cool. You come in, and I've done it, you come in and you get a robe and you sit down and you go through these 4 rooms where they introduce you to different props and sensations and sounds, but it's very improvisational, right? You're having a conversation with a person, you're sort of picking how extreme of an experience that you want, but you're getting to learn about yourself and your own responses to these stimuli. Museum of Ice Cream. Right? This is sort of the beginning of a lot of these really highly marketed pop-up spaces around the city. They're kind of like a modern-day funhouse. Very linear experience. It's almost like a glorified line where there's sort of stop-off rooms that you have that are largely based on aesthetics. They have the sprinkle pit that are just plastic sprinkles. They have the wall of bananas that you take a selfie in front of. A lot of kind of the payoff of this experience is it's your own broadcast afterwards, right? Can I post something on Instagram? But really the experience of walking through it kind of leaves a lot to be desired because it's just stop-offs in these spaces and not a lot of interaction between people. There's no sort of deeper resonance to it. And lastly, Sleep No More. So Sleep No More is immersive theater that's been around for a long time. They started in London. It's in Chelsea in New York. And it's basically a version of Macbeth set in the 1930s where you are in this 4-story warehouse with these masks on, right? You're anonymized, chasing after actors as they kind of play out this story of Macbeth. And so it's a choose your own adventure experience where you have to get physical. You're sort of elbowing through people, and because of this anonymity with the mask, you feel empowered to make different decisions. Actors will interact with you. They'll touch you. They'll bring you into spaces. They'll give you monologues, right? Really quite beautiful. Okay, so these are the 4 experiences that we're going to look at. Across the board, and this is fascinating, boom, every one of these things has sold out. So this is when they first launched or consecutively in their run of show, these things are super popular. People really want experience. And I just briefly want to touch on why they think this is popular. And I know it's maybe uncool to bring business facts to a graphic design lecture, but here we go. So average hours spent across America at work is increasing, and 70% of people are disengaged at their jobs. This is from a Gallup study. The second one is also from a Gallup study that says new generations are seeking experiences that align to their belief system, looking at strong community ties and personal values. And then lastly, and this is a consumer trend since 1987, spending has gone up relatively 70% on experiences over things, right? So what this breaks down to me is that we're searching for meaning, and if we're not finding it in the spaces we inhabit the most, like work, then we have to go somewhere else to find it. And I think this is potentially one of the reasons that these experiences are so popular. So my next question then is, are these experiences then helping people make meaning in their own lives? Back to our original question. So I want to introduce you to 2 frameworks. So on the left side is something that I've put together, and on the right side, I've borrowed it from Abe here. And I've taken the liberty of putting them in dialogue with one another. But they're progressions of experience. So on one side, we have the experience gives me the freedom to see, move, be physical, interact with objects, or then eventually influence the outcome. And on the right side, we have, for me, this experience is a physical experience, emotional experience, or ontological. Is it allowing me to sort of reflect on the nature of my own being? So let's look at these in comparison. So this is subjective, obviously, and I think even, and it is in the camp of emotional, and I think even if an experience is not designed in someone's own emotional subjectivity, they might have some type of emotional response to it. And in this diagram, I'm sort of emphasizing that Whisper Lodge, to me, is sort of getting the closest to sort of an ontological experience because there is that influence there, right? And it is having you reflect on your own nature of being. So this is sort of a snapshot. And I don't think that these other things necessarily need to be ontological, but it just starts to paint the picture of what are some of the elements present that we need in order to start getting to the space of deeper reflection and having that meaning. So when we start thinking about ontological experience, I just wanted to create an analog here, or sort of give us an example. So I want to start looking at rites of passage ceremonies. So rites of passage ceremonies are intended to mark a transitional time in someone's life, and then they reinforce religious views and the values of culture, people's worldview. And there are 3 basic parts of a rites of passage ceremony. There's the separation. So this is when a member of a tribe or a community is separating from them or leaving the sort of current state of themselves. And there's oftentimes some symbolism around this. For example, joining the military and shaving one's head, there's this change. Then there's the liminal space or liminality. So this is when someone is sort of challenging against the rights or trying the rights. And so it can be very ambiguous, but oftentimes it's overcoming challenge. And then at the end here is finally this incorporation. Once the participant or the subject has completed the rites of passage, they're then coming back to their community or tribe in a new status, and oftentimes there is some ceremony and things that happen around that. So these are the Inuits from Alaska, and I am not an anthropologist, but I did some research, and we basically have this breakdown of rites of passage ceremony. So young men, 11 to 12, when they're ready, go out into the wilderness. They try hunting, they face the weather, they come with a shaman to open up communications in nature. And then once they have proven themselves, they've come back. But this is an experience that's been ritualized for generations. And what I think is really interesting about this is that it's affording young men the opportunity for testing and learning. There's that feedback loop in there, right? It passes down wisdom and presents trials to the person. It's an experience designed for authentic discovery. It's literally you against nature, right? It can't get more authentic than that. And then lastly, it has consequence. You could die in this, right? Or you could fail and not be strong enough to sort of try again. So there's a lot of personal stake for someone going through rites of passage to perform in a way or to reflect in a way that they are reaching an elevated status. So when we compare rites of passage to something like the Museum of Ice Cream, we start to see some really interesting contrasts of experiences that are really designed for deep reflection versus experiences that are designed for consumption. I'm gonna take a sip of water real quick. Okay. So, right now, experience design is really good at getting us to this place. But knowing what we know so far, that when we're really present, we can make new meaning. This new meaning allows us personal growth. But a transformative experience is getting to this place where personal growth is deemed very important, so important that it transforms our worldview or transforms our perspective. So there's a scale between growth of me just being like, don't touch hot thing, to growth of saying, wow, there's something here philosophically, right, that I haven't, ontologically, that I haven't been able to see before, and the experience helped me to get there. So I'm gonna show a quick video. Hold on.
My political views as the new right. I say that I'm left. Feminism today is mandated. I would describe myself as a feminist 100%. I don't believe that climate change exists. We're not taking enough action on climate change. And the fact that these people go off their handles and start looking at incredible problems that actually exist. It's actually critical to try to get their own costs. That's not right. You can't. You're man, you're a man, or you're taking off your thing. Women do need to remember that we need you to have our children. Could I be friends with someone that says women's faces in the home? Right, okay, well, I'm an expert at flat packs. If you've any trouble, just watch me. It's that I've got your instructions here. I think so. Let me up here. What's up just that bit there? Describe what it is like to be in 5 adjectives. Okay, frustrating, dedicated, opinionated, lucky. Ambitious, offensive, solemn. I have ups and downs. Strong, I want to say attacks, misunderstood. Name 3 things you and I have in common. We're both male, we're both confident, and we're both loudly spoken. We know each other better than people who've known each other for 10 minutes should. You seem quite ambitious and positive, and you got this really got a glow. Yeah, your aura's pretty cool. I'm sensing, are you from the military or something? People said that, but there is no history. So are you then ex-military? Yeah. If you're ex-military, I'm very proud of you already. Oh, that's nice. I grew up in a bit of a rough state. I've experienced homelessness. I know what it's like to have absolutely nothing. Yeah. So yeah, I'm definitely most grateful just for life. We've only just met, but I think you're the sort of person that would listen to me and we'd have a discussion rather than, oh yeah, you could hang out with that. Let's go. Okay. What's that? You're right, mate. Let me turn it on. Perfect. Oh yeah, there you go. It's basically I thought we just got a bar. Yeah. Okay. Here, each take a bottle and place it on its corresponding markings on the bar. Attention, please now stand to watch a short film.
Okay, and everyone drinks a beer and has a good time. So, in that, this cursor, hold on. Oops. Okay, so in that, the personal stakes are very high, right? And this is what experience design is designing for. It's creating this condition, right, that people can start to make these decisions to have new meaning in their life. So, how do we design for these true experiences then? For me, it's all about this personal and meaningful feedback loop here, and as much that we can create opportunity for this space. So I've mapped these frameworks over on top of it, but we see we can move an emotional space just by having opportunities and creating meaning, but we move more into this space when there's actually stake, personal stake in this choice, having influence over the outcome, right? And being able to have that reflect back into what we mean. So in this case of the Heineken ad, right, there's this choice, right? We keep progressing further and further with one another, and we're influencing this. How are we exchanging with this person? How are we connecting? And then when we have this challenge of upholding our beliefs and sort of communicating with this person, what do we choose? Right? And what does that say about us? So this is a different design process. We are designing for experience rather than designing experience. Our job as experience designers is to create constraints for possibility rather than constraining possibility. And because part of this system is human consciousness, right? We have to take into account someone's own experience and their worldview. We have to be really aware and sensitive to how people are making meaning. And this is where the ethical component of it comes into. So, what inspires us to action? What gives us clues as to what's important stimuli or not? What helps us reflect and make new meaning? And so I love that as an example of just this progression of saying we are continued to be walked along and sort of invited into some type of reflection with another person. And because this is a different type of design practice, I just want to pull out that we're operating with very different principles here. And I think I won't necessarily dive into these quite yet. We can talk about these more over the weekend, but I think that these are things that we really need to consider, right? From the rites of passage to the Museum of Ice Cream, from reflective to consumptive. How do we actually start creating this opportunity to open up? So I'm going to walk through a couple projects that talk a little bit about how I've come into this work, and that will also illuminate a little bit of what we're going to be doing over this weekend in the workshop. So, and Jason says that with some of you, he shared a talk that I gave that talks about my thesis work, that were these dining interactions. I think it's important to know that a lot of my work before this, before I was even calling it experience design, was really thinking about how we create environments to shape behavior. And it was all focused on dining interactions. So a lot of my practice was building these tables that showed people how much they were talking or sort of negotiations they had to do with one another. So the examples I'm going to be showing to you are other dining experiences, but that's just me. They don't all have to be. Okay, so this is a permissions dinner that happened in Thingey in Iceland. This was a design residency that I did for 10 days out there. So Thingey is fascinating. It's the northwest tip of the West Fjords, and this is a 200-person town. It's super tiny, but they have this big church, and they have community pools and hot tubs, which is a big thing of Iceland. It used to be a really big fishing town, but with industrialization and sort of fish farms that are happening close by, that is kind of dwindling. There's not a lot of economic opportunity here, and it's predominantly older generations that are living in this town. And the thing about Iceland is it's some of the youngest geology, some of the youngest earth that is on our planet, which is really fascinating. It has texture and character and so much personality because it is so new. It's figuring itself out and building its ecosystem. So just the relationship of the people to the land, there's so much terminology and kind of metaphor and way of describing their kind of relationship with the space. So in this residency, I applied, there's just one of the fishermen. This is a space that I spent most of the time. I was the only artist that brought Post-it notes, which is definitely a hallmark of things that I do. So I applied for the residency knowing that I wanted to make some sort of dining experience that happened to have something to do with human interaction or social interaction. But I showed up with Post-its, a notebook, and a pencil. And so the first thing I did was just start getting to know the town. It was really about investigating materials. What's available here? What are the objects that people put emphasis on? And what was cool about this town is one main street. So most of the people's stuff is outside. So we found things like rusted rebar and these sort of steel fishing buckets and pallets and these discs. And you start to get really a sense of the aesthetics and the whole tone of this space, right? Golds and dark colors and reds from the rust. And the beaches have this black sand and just all these kind of piles of things left out. So it's beautiful, and it started to be really inspiring to me. And knowing that I wanted to do a dinner, and with previous work, a lot of the kind of system that I was using was make the table show something, show the interaction. I didn't really have that option to me, so it forced me to really look deep in terms of how do we start telling a story about what's happening here. So this is just some of the process. You can see, I'm like, how do I do this without building a table? Or what are some of the elements that I'm seeing? What is the message that I want to convey? And this project was super important to me because eventually through this process of doing tons of post-it notes and material studies, I landed on this. I landed on a story. And this may seem really simple, but from the perspective of experience design, and we'll get out in this more over the weekend, we're telling stories. We're telling stories about relationship. And the story that I fell into in Iceland was that this is a town that is fighting the elements. This is a town that is so secluded, and during the really harsh winter months, they have limited food options. They have to preserve the food by burying it underground that they're going to use in the winter. There is this strong relationship between community that there's almost a begrudging sense to it, right? Because they have to take care of one another, but don't always want to. So there was all these dynamics and these relationships that I found fascinating. And I was like, cool, what if we try and do a dinner about this to sort of show some of this relationship with one another and with the land? So I'll just show you a couple process shots of getting this together, of just some prototyping with just materials that I found. And this is me building it out. Quick story about this. I had spent all day digging these holes. This guy came up to me, started yelling at me and saying that this was a bird sanctuary area. So I had to dig up everything and move it to another place, but it worked out really well because this water was rising, and by the time I brought all my materials out, this whole space was covered in water. So it was kind of a blessing in disguise. And found it to the black sand beach, which actually wound up being better. So here's me earlier in the day of the dinner. I caught this fish. It's like a giant carp who went on the boat. It was super cool. No. We went on a boat and they had a. It was a line. Yeah, it was a big line. And this is what I built. So just to describe what you're looking at here, these were 12, so it's a dinner for 12. We invited people from townspeople as well as people from the residency. And so everyone sits on the pallets. In front of them are buried those fishing buckets, right here, into the ground, and they are filled with dirt. We cut up the fish as well as some root vegetables that we had, and we buried them in packages of tinfoil underneath the dirt inside those fishing buckets. And then you had 2 pits of fire that were going, and then sort of perpendicular to that, we have 2 other buckets filled with ice cold water from the ocean, and at the bottom is rebar and sort of different tools that they can use. And then the lines, these things. So when participants showed up, they slipped one right hand into one of the lines and a left hand into the other. And they were connected with another person with one hand throughout this grid system. They didn't know who. So they sat down, and the beginning was chaos, right? It was them trying to figure out and all talk over one another and trying to figure out who they were connected to. But then they started figuring out, they knew this was a dinner, so they had to get to their pit to reach their hands in to dig out the food. But in order to do that, they had to get slack on their left hand and their right hand so that they would have enough to go. So it began this exchange of who am I giving slack to at a certain moment so they could start to get to the food. And then once they opened the packets, they realized there was uncooked fish, so then they needed to start cooking it. But then to cook it, they realized that, oh, we don't have any tools, so then the people by the water were like, oh, well, I'll just dip my hands in the water. So it's this negotiation with materials and elements and one another and hot and cold and sort of this, it was like 11 o'clock at night and the sun hadn't set, so it was this sort of twilight hour, and it was beautiful, right? So to me, it was like a poem, and that's how I started describing it, was that it was a poem to the way of life.
Super cold.
It wasn't super cold. It was like,
How cold?
I don't know, I'm trying to think. I don't know, it was maybe like 50 degrees. Yeah, maybe a little bit more. There was sort of a permanent chill that was happening all the time, so we were pretty used to it at this moment. And the fire definitely helped. So this to me, it was like a poem about the way of life in Iceland. And it was the first time that I started thinking about experience design from this perspective of how do we start to think about systems and relationships in a broader context where people are having dialogue with one another. So I'll share one more project. So this is Up by 4. Up by 4 is all about a dining experience to model sort of the increase of representation and civil liberties over the history of the United States. So how we represent more people in our democracy. And Athena and I, when we were doing the median, did this project together. And the things that I want to point out, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the meal is 4 courses, and it placed guests in the situation where they're either a role of a representative, a constituent, or a general member, or a non-represented member. And it's all about them making choices and going through different phases where they're trying to negotiate giving up power or sort of helping one another. So it's like me versus other. So I'm going to walk you through the research on this because we are going to get into this over the weekend, but sort of in what Abe was describing in the very beginning of thinking about how do I actually start to understand the system? What is my role as a designer to sort of really deeply understand the dynamics that are happening in this? And then on the opposite side of that, making sure that we're building enough of a system so that people can start to have those experiences for themselves as well. So at the very beginning of this dinner, we looked at the history of the United States. What does representation look like over the course of our country? So in 1789, we have the Constitution talking about equality, but obviously that was only for a very specific demographic of the country. And now today there is more representation, but obviously we still have a long way to go. So trying to really look at these phases of what were the different groups that were in. And we just established a focus area. And this was super broad, but it started to just give us a North Star, really saying, how do we understand this system, right? And then highlighting the roles and the relationships and decisions that need to happen. So from here, we started to map wants and needs and dependencies and manipulations of people within the system. So between representatives, constituents, and non-represented members, what are these points in which, what are their desires in this? And how are they leveraging or working with one another or against one another to fulfill those desires? So we start making these things in this practice, like these diagrams, which then become tools that we design from. And tomorrow and Sunday, we're gonna build similar things to this. And it's a very helpful way of thinking about these. So then from relationships, you start thinking about, okay, well, what do our guests want to know? What do we really hope that they understand, right? And then from here, we start getting into sequencing. Okay, from the system, what are the main events that are happening in between these roles? What are things that they have to do? So in this case, it's representatives having power and making decisions on behalf of a larger body, and this larger body feeling the impact of those decisions and then making more decisions, right? A linear version of this. And I'm rushing through this just to kind of show the scope of saying that, like, really, this is about tackling this beast, right? How do we actually really understand what are the frictions, what are the dynamics, what are the roles, what are the relationships? And as much as we can understand about this system so we can then build an experience from it, is the thing that's really going to inform the design practice. And as Abe was talking about, this was sort of the slow movement design practice, right? We're going to get into these things and really understand the nuance and the details of them. And then again, stories. So then we finally get to this place, and what was different from the dinner in Iceland, that was sort of this kind of poem that I'd written, is that there's a bunch of really specific, and there's a multitude of stories that we want to start telling within representation and democracy. So the story of voting, the story of organizing, the story of power. And as we start to build an experience from this, it's thinking about what are the different concurrent tracks of activity that we need to build in order to start telling these stories, because they are all happening at the same time. So there's levels of complexity. So then from here we start sketching, and they're what I'm starting to call experiential metaphors, which we'll play with this weekend as well. But the question we ask ourselves is, from the dynamics that we're seeing in the system and the roles and relationships we're seeing in the system, how do we model that? How do we build something for that creates a similar dynamic? So in this, we start thinking about how do participants start to identify themselves without us explicitly giving them a role? Or what are the things that we bring in that get people to start voting? How do we start to then simulate feedback? And so it's thinking about objects, environments, aesthetic, tone, the role of the server as being a facilitator, but just by kind of presenting a choice, all these start to sort of build up into this logic of your experience of like, how does resource sharing and like trickle down economics work, right? These are questions we're asking ourselves in relationship design. And so it's super exciting because the sky's the limit. You can build or think of anything you want as long as this starts to come together to form just the structure that people are making decisions in. And then the kind of final sequencing. So this is where we start to lay out what is actually the run of show here? What if we were sort of looking at this from a theatrical sense? What are kind of the actions that we have to take? So I'll quickly run through this. We decided on 3 environments for representatives, constituents, and non-represented members. This is the representative table that's nice, it has tablecloth and flower.
I think it might be clearer for people if you explain a representative would be like a congressperson.
Like a congressperson, yeah.
Someone who had been elected to make decisions.
Yes, yeah,
And
an
the
elected.
constituent are people that have the right to vote.
Yeah,
And then the other people are subject to all the rules, but
don't have any right to vote, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Did everyone hear that? Cool. So yeah, in this case, the representative have this nice table. Constituents are sort of general members. They don't have their own individual seating. There's sort of less availability of popsicles or of flatware, so we're using popsicle sticks and other sort of objects. And then non-represented members have sort of just an area that they're congregating in. And we wanted to be careful about not making this so socioeconomic. There could be non-representative members who are sort of well off economically, but just from where they come from. Maybe not be able to participate in the system. So there's a little bit of kind of playing of how do we make sure that we're not being too heavy-handed in one area. So to start walking through some of the kind of tracks of activity. So one of the things that we identified here was resource distribution. So a lot of times non-represented members will be a part of a labor class that will be supplying a lot of resources to the system. So one of the things that we wanted to play with here, and we go back here, these bins were filled with bottles of water, and they were locked though. And so if the non-represented members wanted to get water, they would need to lobby through the members, their sort of constituents, then ask the representatives to get a key. That key would eventually come down where they could open the water, and us as servers would bring that water to the representatives, and it would trickle down through the system to then eventually come back to the non-represented members. And it became sort of a representation of attention of when you're trying to lobby for yourself to say that we want to be a part of this system and you need to treat us more fairly, you either have a choice of kind of playing to the appeal of representatives by giving the water, or you withhold the water, even though you may not get it, but you withhold the water in order to create some of a leverage point to make different decisions. So we start to present conditions like that for people to make decisions around, but we're not explicit around it. We just start to create these relationships that people can start to identify. So we're not giving them rules, we're giving them these scenarios. And so here you see, this is Costa opening up the water. Well, and he's from, so we gave him these stickers in the beginning when there was sort of a cocktail hour, so they like got a little appetizer, and underneath was a sticker, and the servers were already wearing one, so people just self-identified, put the sticker on, came to the table. So what else happened? So selecting food. So the whole purpose was built around dining and representatives selecting food on behalf of the members. So members got these generic menus that were between red and blue, while representatives got really specific menus and could order exactly what they wanted. But then when members got this food, their menus, so general members, they all had to sort of collectively get feedback together in this basin through eye drops. And so it was sort of this metaphor of saying that the feedback oftentimes that can come from your members can be very clouded and non-specific, right? That we don't actually have we don't have a lot of great tools in order to be very specific about the things that we're asking for, and our representatives can have very unclear pictures about what that is. So if you have a majority of people that want steak over chicken, the one thing of red dye is actually not gonna make much of a difference. Whereas if it's half and half, it's absolutely much more difficult. And then lastly here, there's sort of this element of voting. So the thing about this experience is that it was cyclical. With each course, you had a different movement of voting in new representation, and then we, as the servers, would bring someone from the non-represented group into the constituents. And so people had upwards mobility within the system. And so this dynamic was really interesting because it started to create competition. So these two guys, this is Costa on the right, and this is Marcio on the left. Costa was trying to break the system the entire time and basically sort of fight against it, but in his effort to fight against the system, started developing followers, right? People started to really back and believe in Costa. Marcio kind of played this benevolent constituent, right, where he was looking to sort of non-represented members to see if he could find ways to help them in making sure that everyone was comfortable. So this is a moment where they go down to the non-representative side and help them make a table and get it off the ground. And sort of they're immediately back to the other table to then lobby about what they had just done to see if they can gain favor, which is fascinating. And it worked. They became representatives in the next round. And things like this popped up in this experience sort of unprovoked. And let me, it was chaotic. We thought people were going to sit at their table, but they didn't. People are moving around. Things are so mobile. There's so much discussion. There's so much lobbying. So, those who tried to break the system eventually came into power. Representation emerged, trying to help people, but ultimately they were looking to improve their own situation. When we talked to members after the experience about why they didn't try and make it more of an equal system, a lot of them were like, I didn't want to risk the fact that my situation could get worse, right? It was good enough now. Or there was things where I tried, but I couldn't build enough of a coalition amongst our table in order to make change at the group, right? These are insights about the way that the system actually works, and these people are going through it in a lived experience of being a representative is very hard because I'm not sure which choice to make and I don't want to have this responsibility, right? Time after time again that we did this, we kept getting the feedback from people about this is the thing that I felt in this moment making this decision, and I have so much more insight and empathy to how this system actually works. It was fascinating. I guess I'll just reiterate, so much of the context, relationships, influence, and choice, right? That's what this is all about. And in us modeling a system, getting insight from that as a tool and a perspective for designers is super valuable. So I'm going to bring Ava. Yeah, you're up now.
Okay. Okay. Where are we? He's coming back. Don't worry. What?
You can say.
What? He's coming back. He's coming back. You don't. More applause. So I like the passing of the mic. I feel like a 1950s crooner here. So I just wanted to drop in and talk about practical applications of this way of thinking, because what we're talking about with experience design is very much a series of practices that are aimed at developing a deeper understanding of systems, but it's also a way of thinking about your design approach that you can then use to radically change regular design practices. Because there's a fundamental notion, and that is that if you're not designing for something, if you're not reconsidering the way a thing is done, you're using the default method that's out there, that you were taught, or that's in the culture. So I started doing architecture about 20 years ago. I started doing architecture 20 years ago, and I found it frustrating to practice the way architecture was practiced. It's a very commodity-focused approach to something that is very much about community. It's very much about meaning. It's very much about the way we live. I mean, if there's anything that is a practice that leads to experience design, it's architecture. You're designing buildings, and all of life is happening inside those designs. Can somebody fix this design? So, and I worked at firms, and I worked for myself, and I designed things, and what I found was that architects were coming in pretty kind of too late in the process. You'd sort of show up, and you'd already be asked to come up with you'd be asked to do form making right away, right? And that was troubling, but I was young and I was kind of following the way it was done. But as I did more architecture, as I developed more plans and eventually had my own practice, designing people's homes, I was struck more and more and more by the fact that designing a house, building a house, is an incredible outlay of resources. And it's not just money, right? These things are expensive to build, right? Probably if you're building your home, you're spending more money on it than you've ever spent on anything else. But it's actual material that costs money and that has external costs to the environment and to our world. It's carbon footprint, and it's your emotional expenses, right? And it's your time. I mean, this is such an unbelievable investment that we make. And usually that comes at the point of us saying, okay, what do you want your house to look like? Here we are, we're back. We want it to look like this, right? So the main design focus is generally, what do you want your house to look like? And it's not all these other things. What do you want your life to be in that house? So while I was practicing while I was practicing architecture, I was thinking about this problem, and I went for a walk in Big Sur. Has anybody ever been to Big Sur? It's beautiful. It's a good place to go for a walk and think about the big questions. I highly recommend it. And I was with my friend Matthew Perdon, and we were talking about this problem. This is not just a problem unique to architecture. It's a problem unique to all the creative practices, common to all the creative practices. He was a painter and a theater maker, and I also was a poet and an architect, and we were talking about this frustration, right? This frustration with this way of creating, and we thought, okay, why don't we start doing some experiments? What if we just pick a person and start with that person and study that person so well and so thoroughly that we can understand their subjectivity enough that we can create something that we know will move them? And we thought this would be maybe one experiment or two experiments, but 17 years later, I'm still doing this. And over the years, we did lots of things. We created these week-long, weekend-long, months-long performances for one-person audiences. It was sort of like they would wake up one day and be in a movie and be the main character and not have the script. And we were able to do anything we wanted because we weren't limited by form or by known practice. We were just focused on the experience we wanted to create for the person. So we maybe wanted to write a book because we knew they were into books, and we knew they loved, say, Italo Calvino. And so we'd write an Italo Calvino book and tell them that this book was found on Italo Calvino's dead body, or Azul Solar book. And then, of course, we had a publishing company, and so our publishing company published these books, which are real because, you know, they're reviewed in the New York Times. And to make sure that people knew they were real, we would update Wikipedia and maybe hack the New York Times and review the books in the New York Times so that people would feel that they were real. And so these stories that we were writing invaded people's lives, and they had signed up for it, right? And we were noticing that the different ways that stories enter people's lives created different experiences of those stories. Like, what is a story? We think, oh, it's a story. A happened, then B happened, then C happened. But actually, our life is a series of tidal waves of stories that are small and large, and we experience them totally differently. This lecture is a story, your day is a story, your whole life is a story, and these things enter into your consciousness in totally different ways. And we were finding that if we thought about it, we could have stories enter into people's lives in totally different ways. And so we found ourselves kidnapping people, burying them alive, burning them at the stake, well, almost burning them at the stake. And we found ourselves inserting moments of beauty into these quotidian spaces in their lives. And as we were doing this, we were taking notes for 17 years. We were taking notes. We were understanding the difference between experiencing a story for an hour and experiencing it for 3 hours, a week, or 3 months. We were taking notes on what happens when the experience you're going through involves events in your life that are really meaningful to you, or fictional events that are conceptually important to you. And as we were doing all this, my architecture practice was influencing this performance practice. But at the same time, the performance practice was influencing my architecture practice. So when I was in grad school, I had an opportunity to build myself a house. And because I was broke, and because I was doing a lot of the work myself, it was inadvertently a long architecture project. And for a long time, I had a chance to just walk the site. And every day I would go by and experience the sounds on the site and get to know the materials on the site, the fauna, the flora, the sounds of the birds, the experience of the rain coming down as it does only that particular way in that particular part of Texas, and the winds, and of course the heat. And when I came around to building my house, it struck me that being in that place meant having those sensory experiences. And of course I needed to be protected from rain, wind, tornadoes. A tornado hit the house while I was building it. And critters that would come and bite me. But I didn't want to have that experience that we tend to have with buildings, which is being completely separated from the exterior world. And so I ended up building this house as a kind of butterfly roof, right? So instead of shedding the water off, I shed the water into the middle of the house. And there, in the very center of the house, I placed a fountain, so that any time it rained, the water would gather in the center of the house, collect in the fountain, and trickle over in the fountain. So it would always be connected. I would never be separate. And then I pulled all these materials from the site and made them into parts of the house itself. And that experience taught me a lot about what actually was possible when making a home and thinking more long-term, and thinking not just in terms of the form and the shape it's going to take, but in terms of the life it might create. And so I started to break down architecture with my clients and with myself into this, what I call the design triad. And that is friends and family, mission, meaning, art, and aesthetics. Usually we just start with the third, art and aesthetics. What do you want your house to look like? Do you want it to be blue? Do you want it to have bricks? Do you want it to seem like a farmhouse? That's usually where architecture starts, and that's usually where our conversation around it starts. But if we take the time, we can focus, for instance, on friends and family, right? Your home determines the way you relate to your family. Are the children and the parents always on top of each other? Or are they separate? Does everybody have their own wing? Does the home have formal spaces for entertainment and community? Or is it the kind of place where friends come by, they enter into the private sanctum of family, and then they leave? All these design decisions are decisions about how we want to live. Likewise, art and aesthetics is not just how the place looks, but how you want to relate in your life to art and aesthetics. It sounds very superficial. Okay, you want it to be pretty. But actually, we all have incredibly deep relationships with our aesthetic worlds. And those relationships are, in fact, meaningful relationships. What is minimalism to you? Why do you want so few things? Why do you want a cluttered life? How does this relate to your ideas about environmentalism? How does this relate to your ideas about what it is to live in a rich world, in a world of abundance, or in a world of parsimony? All these questions and more, like how do you feel about art in the world? What the role of artists is in your life and in general. How would you like to support that? And finally, mission and meaning. What are you doing with your life? Why do you have your career? How could your home support that or not? And so I just wanted to bring one brief example of this, of a house that I've recently completed in upstate New York. And this house is on a farm. It's a biodynamic farm. And the farmers have a family. They're young, and they have 3 kids, and they're probably going to have more. And they were living in a tiny little house. It was the house that was there when they moved when they bought the property. Originally, they just said, we want a bigger house so we're not so crowded. But we took the time and looked at the triad and did a lot of walking and talking and digging into the ideas behind the farm. It turns out the farm is not just any kind of farm, it's a biodynamic farm. And I won't go into all of what biodynamics is, but it does involve a sensitivity to balance and to creating almost a community of life on the farm. And also we dug into their life, we got to know their communities. We started to see that if they could, they would want to be the hub of the community. They would want to be a place that invited people in. And all this led to a number of design decisions, but the most important was this one, the atrium at the center of the house. They wanted a bigger house, yes, but they didn't want to lose that sense that everybody was always connected. And so we ended up making a house that was probably about 3,500 square feet, not enormous, but not tiny. But this house had the smallest bedrooms allowed by code. They would have made it smaller if code had allowed us to make it smaller. The family did not want anybody hiding in their rooms. They wanted to always be in contact. But at the same time, they didn't want to always be on top of each other and annoying each other. So we created this atrium so that upstairs, kids could be playing while downstairs, adults would be doing the adult things, cooking, relating to community, or everybody could come together. And what happened was that they became the center of the community. They became a hub for life in the more intentionally designed farm communities in upstate New York, which is kind of a hotbed of these ways of thinking. It was really interesting. So I just offer this as an example because the things that Alex is presenting may seem idealistic, but what you can do after this is you can start to take these practices and apply it to the systems that you're embedded in all the time, and the design practices that you're finding that you're deep in, and rethink the structure of your approach to them. So that said, I'm going to hand it back like a crooner at an old in Vegas to Alex and let him take us home.
Thanks, Abe. Cool. So, I know we're a little over time, but I just wanted to say this last bit. Why is any of this useful to you? Which is a continuation of what Abe has said. Junior year of my undergrad in college, I was taking a semiotics course. Semiotics is the study of meaning of objects and signs and symbols. But our professor said this to us: image sees, image feels, image acts. And it was a very inspiring moment to me. It was sort of a game changer in terms of the way that I think about design. And it basically means this: the things we see influence how we feel and therefore how we act. And especially, I was a graphic design undergrad major, right? Thinking about the relationship of posters and branding and the materials I was making to feelings and action was super inspiring. I'm gonna skip over this, we're fine. So in design, a lot of things require us to sort of have action, but I think really this is the most important thing of this set, is the feeling. And coincidentally enough, feelings are a big catalyst for this, right, for reflection. In our world right now, we are sort of in this war between rational thought and sort of civic dialogue. We're very much sort of in this space of making decisions on feelings right now. And so the more that we as designers can really start to sharpen our tools and expand our tool set to start considering ways in which we might prompt people to feel and to understand why they feel that way and understand the relationships and the systems that we're part of that are sort of inspiring some of those feelings, the more that we can start solving really big challenges, like here in climate change. I think I'm gonna end it there, since we're over time, but I just wanted to thank all of you. There's tons to talk about this weekend, and I'm super excited for the session that we have upcoming. So thank you for your attention. Thank you again for having me. Yeah.